Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me from the ECW West Coast Bureau is my friend Tonya McQuade. Tonya, hello, hello, hello.
Hello, hello. Good to see you today.
It is always a pleasure to be able to have the chance to chat with you. So thanks for taking some time to talk with us today.
Sure.
And I'm glad to shine a little spotlight on your latest book called A State Divided. Tell us a little bit about these letters that you have collected into this cool book.
Well, it was actually a pretty amazing story how it came about. I've done family research for years on Ancestry.com, and somebody contacted me through Ancestry.com and said that he had this box of old family letters, that his dad was a real estate agent and rescued it from a woman's house that he was selling. She was throwing it away because she said she had no one to give it to. And he held on to the box for 30 years.
Oh my
And
God.
then found his sons. So the son finally is the one who found my ancestry family tree and saw a bunch of these names in my family tree. And so he contacted me and said, hey, if it was my family history, I'd want these letters. Are you interested? And I, of course, said yes. And we ended up having an hour-long conversation the next day. I was actually the third person he'd contacted. The
Oh,
first one
wow.
never responded. The second one said they had enough letters.
Wow. Wow.
And
Like good
so,
for him. Good for him for sticking to it,
oh
you know?
yeah, oh yeah. And so we talked and arranged for him to mail me the letters. And so it was a box of about 100 letters, and 50, it turned out, were from the Civil War. So 40 were written by my third great grandfather, James Calloway Hale, and another 10 were written by Benjamin Petrie, who was the brother of my great great grandfather. And so most of the letters were addressed to my great great grandfather and his wife, who was the daughter of James Hale. And so they got passed down through the family and finally made their way to me. And so,
Wow.
initially I started just having to work at transcribing them because, as you can imagine, making out these letters that were on old stationery, and some were faded, and some had pieces missing and they weren't in any sort of order. So I started transcribing them thinking I wanted to learn the family history. And then I realized this was way more valuable than just family history, that I wanted to be able to share it with other people. And so it turned into this massive research project learning about the Civil War in Missouri.
Wow. Wow. And of course, that's just a hot mess. Yeah, I don't know any other better way to describe Missouri in the Civil War than hot mess. Um, but I want to go back to you talk about like sort of just the physical challenges of transcribing Civil War era letters.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think people appreciate necessarily just how challenging that can be. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, so my first thing that I did was carefully unfold them and put them in order because they were just piled into a box. And so I put them in order and put them in archival plastic so that I could start working with them that way. And then the letters by James Hale, he actually had pretty good writing and spelling. And his handwriting wasn't terrible to read. Like, there were some things that I struggled with, and over time it got easier. Like, at one of the letters I translated, I thought he wrote to his wife asking how she was doing fattening up the frogs. And I thought, do they eat a lot of frogs? And it
But
just didn't make much sense, but it looked like frogs. And then several letters later, he asked again about the hogs. And I'm like, oh, that makes so much more
um, yeah,
sense.
yeah. So once you
And
figure out like, oh, this is how he makes his H's, then
right, exactly. And then names that I couldn't make out the first time, but then they came up again, and I went back and I was able to piece it together. So little by little, I also had to figure out his slang. One thing he said over and over was "they is," and I kept that in the letters because I liked that voice. They is many people here doing this, they is. Other spelling I tried to correct just for the sake of being able to read the letters more easily. But he talked about the secesh over and over, the
yeah.
secesh. That was what they called them. And so at first I mean, I figured that one out pretty quickly. And then he talked about people taking a French. Do you know what that is, to take a French?
I do not. What does it mean to take a French?
Well, it
It's,
turns
it
out
sounds very Beauregardian. But,
it turns out it was a French furlough, and it meant you just walked off and deserted for a while. And I
so
thought,
it is a
wow,
Beauregard thing.
I thought they already had that reputation in the Civil War.
Take some time off, eat some cheese, come back, you
Yeah,
know.
exactly. And he really wanted a furlough and kept not getting his furlough. And so he was talking about other people taking a French, and he felt too guilty to do that. He thought it would bring shame to his family, but eventually he's considering it because he hasn't gotten his furlough. As far as I know, he never did. He actually did finally get a couple of furloughs over his 3-year period. But yeah, take a French.
Wow, wow. And when you talk about like the secession stuff, I remember the first time I had to transcribe a Civil War letter from one of my own ancestors. And he used the word sutler. And, at that time in my own Civil War career, like I didn't know what a sutler was. So I'm like, what is this strange word? And so not only do I have to figure out his handwriting and his spelling, but then his vocabulary as well, uh,
Yeah.
which is a bigger challenge than a lot of people would realize it would be.
Yeah, and then he talked about gar fish, which I had never heard of, but we actually went to an aquarium in Atlanta this
Yeah,
year, and
right.
I saw a gar fish for the first
Yeah,
time.
okay.
But they caught a lot of gar when he was staying in Helena, Arkansas, and he was making gar soup. He talks about the various groups coming through from different states, and the way he spelled some of those was pretty interesting. And one of my favorite spellings wasn't actually from his letter, it was from another relative who wrote about one of the nephews who apparently was a prodigal son, kind of a nephew. He was off in the Sandwich Islands, which is now Hawaii, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. An ocean was Otion,
Oh, well.
like lotion.
Well, that
And
makes sense, I guess.
Pacific. And another place they talked about a bouquet, Bocay, of flowers.
Sounding it
So
out. Yeah,
yeah, sounding it out. So there were a bunch of letters from the Oregon Trail that were written by the wife of one of James's brothers. So his brother Meshach was killed by Confederate guerrillas in 1861, pretty early in the war. And his wife and son ended up joining a wagon train with her brother to go live in Walla Walla, Washington. And so there were quite a few letters from her back to the family. Hers were harder to read.
Mhm.
She had more creative spelling, probably had less education, and skipped words frequently. And most of the letters have no punctuation. I don't know if you've noticed that in reading old letters, but
Yeah.
so you're reading it thinking, does the sentence end here, or is this part of the next sentence? And you're trying to make sense of words that are missing and all of those things. But her letters just kind of were crazy to read, talking about what they experienced on the Oregon Trail. That was a whole other part of the history that was fascinating. In one paragraph, there's a stampede and people are killed by Indians and people get sick and die, and they come across a wagon train where people had been scalped, and but we're doing okay.
We're fine. Yeah, yeah. We're going through the mountains and I'm very hungry and it's snowing. That's
Yeah.
like,
So
oh,
it was filled with history, this whole box, and the box had um my great grandfather's eyeglasses. So those kind of eyeglasses you see in Civil War museums, I now have, that you can pull the sides out and put them on. And there were some old tin type photos from my great grandmother and her sisters, and there's a couple that are of young men who it's possible one of them is James Hale, but I'm not positive. Unfortunately, they're not labeled. Um, there were pieces of dresses from some of my great grandmothers, and some of those were labeled, and one of the pictures has somebody wearing the dress that this material is from, so that was pretty
wow.
cool.
Wow.
And then the most special thing, what I put on the cover of the book, is the flag that my great grandmother made for her father that he carried with him all through the war. And so that was also included with the letters that Jeremy, who contacted me on Ancestry, sent me. So it was quite a treasure.
So I'm going to ask you to put on two different hats here. One is Tanya, the family member, and then one is Tanya, the historian. And so as a
And it's
family,
actually Tonya with an
oh,
O.
Tonya, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So what's it like to get this box of stuff that connects you with, a family member from generations ago?
It kind of blew me away. I mean, I've been doing family history research for more than 20 years. I've been on Ancestry for a long time, creating my family trees. And mostly you get names and dates and occasionally a short little newspaper article. You might get a little bit of information, but there were 40 letters that were each about 4 pages long from my great 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 grandfather. And you get into his head and see his fears and his frustrations and at times his anger and his worries about his family. And it was pretty amazing to understand those emotions that he was going through as he went through the war. And also just to understand what the average soldier was experiencing, because mostly what I had read about the Civil War was mostly on the East Coast, first of all, not very much about Missouri at all. And mostly from the captain's general's perspective, not what the average person is thinking. And worrying about when are we going to get paid? That was one of the common concerns in his letters. It's been 4 months since we got paid, and he's got a wife and 3 little kids at home. And when he enlisted for 3 years, nobody thought it was going to last for so long, right? He thought he'd be home before too long, and he joined what was called the Merchants Regiment, where they were going to get some kind of bounty paid to them. So probably money was a concern from the beginning. And now he's not getting paid, and he's worried about his wife and kids, and other soldiers too are frustrated, and they're talking about stacking arms and refusing to drill. Those weren't the things that were in my history book.
Right. But those sort of bread and butter issues are so real, because like
Mhm.
I'm going to go off and join the army as a way to provide for my family, and then you can't provide for a family. Well, why am I in the army?
Right, right. And then there's the whole other part. One of the other things that made me really think. So Bayless Petrie was my great great grandfather, and he married James's daughter. And so he's 23. He's just gotten married and his wife is about to have a baby, and his father-in-law decides to enlist in the army. So he's on the farm taking care of his wife, pregnant wife, his mother-in-law, and 3 kids who are 14, 12, and 6. And then his brother Benjamin gets drafted and leaves behind a wife with a 3-year-old, 2-year-old, and 7-month-old. And here's Bayless, the only man with 3 families he's taking care of, and he's also worried about whether he's going to get drafted.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and then
And-
what do all those other people do when their breadwinner gets hauled off to the army? That's a
right,
scary thing.
right. And Benjamin didn't get drafted until quite late, so he started in November 1864, and then he ended up having to travel to New York to get on a ship to take him to South Carolina to meet up with Sherman and march with Sherman through the Carolinas campaign, and then Washington, D.C. for the Grand Procession. And so he had a very different experience than James Hale had. And his letters were interesting too. I only had 10 letters from him, and less detail about his experience, because during the marching campaign, I don't know how much time he got to to
Yeah,
write
right. Yeah.
letters,
Oh,
and the ones I have were to his brother, so he probably, if he only had a little time, was writing more of them to his wife. But it still gets some interesting descriptions of what they're going through.
yeah.
And
It's interesting to me, like, the documentary trail that does not get left because by 1864 and 1865, the armies are in constant motion. And so there's, and with Sherman, he's just not plugged into an infrastructure that lets people send letters. It's
Mhm.
really crazy. Yeah.
And just having paper, having stamps. James writes to his wife about please send stamps, because when they get stamps, they're immediately sold out,
Yeah, right.
and it's hard to get stamps. And some of his paper is on official stationery, and a lot of it is just on, plain paper. Um, some of the official stationery is really fun, the designs that you get from that. And then one of the most fun letters, it came in an envelope about this big, and all it says is Bayless Petrie, St. Joseph, Missouri. That's the address. And that one was from one of his cousins, who signs it Rachel at Rebel Rendezvous. And she's basically smack talking him, saying he should join the rebel cause.
Oh my gosh.
So, so each of them had families that were torn apart. It wasn't just that the country was torn apart and Missouri was torn apart, but their own families. James came from Tennessee, and he had families still that were there, and his mother had had at least 3 slaves that are mentioned in one family letter, because it says that when her health fails, two of the older brothers are taking care of her, and they're hiring out her three Negroes to help pay for her care.
Wow.
And so there were some nephews that fought for the Confederacy, I know, in his family. And Bayless got that letter from his cousin. So there were family members in other places. And Missouri, of course, was a slave state where they were living, although neither of their families had slaves. And the area where they were, it was less common than along the river, which was the area called Little Dixie.
Right, right, right.
Um,
Wow, wow. So yeah, and that really kind of goes to show, and you talk about those families divided, and Tennessee, depending on where you are geographically, things are really either pro Union or pro South, and Missouri, it's all mixed up, neighbor versus neighbor stuff, and so as you're trying to kind of piece together all of these bits of evidentiary trail, how do you come to a picture of your own family as a result of all that?
Well, one of the most helpful things was when we made two different trips to Missouri. The first trip was already planned before I got these letters because I'd been interested to go to Kirksville, which is where I knew my great-great-grandparents had lived, and my dad had always wanted to visit there. And so we had planned a trip. And by the time we went, I had gotten these letters. And so I went to the Missouri Civil War Museum in St. Louis, which is at the former Jefferson Barracks. And James Hale spent a lot of his time at Benton Barracks, which no longer exists, but it was just north of there. And so going through the museum there helped me to understand a lot more about what was going on in St. Louis at the time. And he actually got so sick while he was in Helena, Arkansas, which was in one place called the most insalubrious place that existed. And 100 men in his regiment got sick one month and died.
Oh my
So
God.
he ended up in the hospital in St. Louis in July of 1863, or by the end of June, he had been transferred to the hospital. Unfortunately, he got better, but not well enough to return to the field. So he was transferred into the Invalid Corps, which later was renamed the Veteran Reserve Corps. And so he spent 2 years helping at Benton Barracks and the Marine Hospital, sometimes guarding Confederate prisoners that were brought in for medical reasons, sometimes helping with cleaning out, doing, basic duties around the camp. But so that helped a little bit to understand more what he did there. And one of the most helpful books I found was written by it was a nurse who was stationed there. She was the supervisor of nurses at the hospital there while he was there. And her mother put together her diary entries and letters after she died. And she had gotten sick when she was on a hospital ship going down to help with Vicksburg. And so she suffered kind of bouts of malaria and different health issues throughout the rest of her life. But her letters overlapped what he was describing in many of his. And she even writes about the men that just arrived, and he would have been one of those men. And she talks about the 4th of July celebration that they had, and he writes about that. And so it was really interesting to get additional details from her perspective. And she even stopped in Helena, Arkansas in one of her, when she was on the hospital ship. And I actually was going to read this one thing for you, and I have some other things if you want to hear some excerpts. But she says, "We are now in Helena. Look on the map," she's telling her parents, "and you will see it. Imagine living in the midst of what the children call a dirt pie, and you will have an idea of the condition of the people."
A dirt pie.
Living in
Okay.
a dirt pie. So anyway, the second trip though is the one that was the most helpful for understanding Andrew County. So I dragged my husband back to Missouri that same year for another trip. And this time we flew into Kansas City and we stayed in St. Joseph. And so Andrew County is a little bit north of St. Joseph, and this is where their families had been living. And it became known as Bloody Andrew because there was so much guerrilla fighting going on. And so I arranged to meet with the genealogist at the Andrew County History Museum before we even went. And she had done a lot of research. When we arrived, she had pages showing me all of the real estate transactions, where they had bought land and lived and when they'd sold it, and some other little blurbs that were from family history, legal transactions, and had maps for me. But she ended up becoming one of my first readers of my book. And names that I skipped over because they were just random people that he mentioned that weren't famous generals or captains that were going to be online. She would write back, oh, well, he became a lawyer in Andrew County and he lived here and this street's named after him. And I mean, she
Yeah.
just had all this information. And two of the men that he ended up, they were also sick in Helena with him. And when they stayed behind and were fishing for gar, she said, oh, they were both from Andrew County. They survived the war. They came home and they did this. And
Oh,
so it
wow.
was amazing to hear those kinds of details. And so she helped a lot. And then I started having to look at newspapers, old newspapers. I subscribed to newspapers.com on ancestry.com because, as she pointed out, they have very little that survived from the Civil War there. Each side attacked each other's newspaper offices and burned everything. And St. Joseph had about 200 men that fought for the Union and about 200 that fought for the Confederacy. That's how divided it was. And the same mayor, when we stayed in St. Joseph and went to a bunch of the museums there too, the mayor was Meriwether Jeff Thompson, who became a Confederate general later on. And he had been the mayor when the Pony Express began, because it started in St. Joseph. He did the big kickoff and gave his
Oh, wow.
speech. And the following year, he was pulling down the flag over the post office and leading riots against the Union. And
Wow.
then he ended up helping to steal weapons from the Liberty Arsenal in Clay County and hide them throughout the area. And then he fled and joined the Confederacy. So, and he was one of the last ones to surrender because, Missouri, I'd always sort of learned, well, Lee surrenders and it's over. But in Missouri, it's 45 days later when they're finally having the last surrenders. And I got a link to a bunch of the letters that were going around among the military leaders in Missouri. And one of them, here, I'll read just part of this one. There was a letter from Jeff Thompson, and he hasn't heard yet what's going on. It's April 30th, and they're just getting the news of the surrender. And he says, your favor of the 18th instant, enclosing a copy of your communication to Major General J.F. Fagan, has this instant reached me. Being disposed to believe that you are actuated by philanthropic principles in making these propositions or are acting in conformity to orders, I receive them in more kindness than I otherwise would. But I respectfully and most positively decline accepting your offer. And it goes on. But they're trying to propose terms for his surrender, and he's still at this point not ready to do it. But he does add a PS, allow me to express my sincere regret and horror at the manner in which President Lincoln came to his death. So once he does decide to surrender, he has to work hard to find his soldiers because they're spread throughout the swampy areas of Arkansas. And so getting word out was very difficult. And then a lot of the question, of course, in Missouri was, what do we do with the guerrillas? Do they get to surrender like everybody else, or are they outlaws and now they have to be tried, and are they criminals? And many of them fled to Texas, and some of them fled to Mexico, and some of them snuck back in. But of course, there's the famous line that I just think, what would it be like to hear this? The rebels are our countrymen again. Everybody go home, basically.
Yeah, right, right.
And when your county has been torn apart by guerrilla fighting, how do you do that? How do the families sit back down together again? And it's a question for today too, because we know we're living in a very divided country in a lot of ways where many families have been divided.
Yeah, yeah. So it's now I had asked you earlier to kind of talk about this from your perspective as a family member and getting this treasure trove. Now, as a historian, as you're trying to kind of piece together the story, here you've got these letters, and you have to figure out, okay, first of all, how do I piece them together? What story do they tell? And then what do I need to find to tell that fuller story? How did you've talked a little bit about how you've stitched that together, but when you're first looking at that box full of stuff,
Mhm.
what's going through your head as a historian looking at this box
Well,
of resources?
the first thing I had to do was read a lot about the Civil War in Missouri. because I didn't know what a lot of the references were in the letters. I hadn't studied the timeline of events. I didn't know the names of the people who were the key key leaders. There's a lot of people that are just referred to by a first name. In the Rebel Cousin letter, she talks about hurrah for Jeff. Jefferson Davis, hurrah for Jeff. and so trying to figure out who all of these people are. So I had to start with some basic history because especially the guerrilla fighting, I didn't understand how all of that had worked, who the leaders were, William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, and the attack on Lawrence, Kansas, the role that had played. But then you've also got the Jayhawkers coming in across the border, and that whole Bleeding Kansas border war. One of the things that I mentioned in the book is a lot of people think the Civil War actually started in many ways in Missouri. And
Right.
so my first chapter is all these events that happen before the war even begins. And it kind of starts in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, because they're agreeing not to have slavery over this, they set the line, no slavery above this line. And then Missouri is bordered by 4 slave and 4 free states. So it's really in the middle of it all. And then in 1836, they add this area called the Platte Purchase, which is where Andrew County is. And it's that little northwest corner, like the border
Oh,
was
that
this,
little,
but
yeah.
now it does this. That's where they lived. And it broke the 1820 compromise because they're now adding slave territory. And so they kind of overlook it, but then we get to 1850 and they're debating about, and the other part of the compromise, of course, in 1820 is Missouri was allowed to come in as a slave state and Maine came in as a free state to balance it out. But then in 1850, they're bringing in California and they're deciding that territories are going to get to decide using popular sovereignty whether they're going to be slave or free. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act, of course, does that as well. And so that sets off this crazy fraudulent time in Kansas,
Yeah.
right? As people are coming in from the Northeast to try to make it be a free state, and people are crossing the border from Missouri to try to make it be a slave state. And you have a couple governments each claiming they're the rightful government. And you have John Brown starting out there. We think of him more with Harper's Ferry, but he actually is very active there in the border wars, and he and his sons are involved in killing and a group
Ottawa
of
Creek.
people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so all of that was background. And then the Dred Scott decision, when I was there, we went to the courthouse and that started in Missouri. And then you get this decision from the Supreme Court that has a huge impact on, are you citizens or not? Do you have legal rights or not? So all of that is kind of starting there. And it was the only state in 1860 that, chose, now I'm forgetting, was it Breckinridge? They were the only state to choose whoever they chose. Like they were definitely in their own thinking, and they were supporting Douglas more than Lincoln in a lot of his ideas. So trying to understand all of that was a big part of it. And then I read this interesting book about Jesse James in the Civil War
Okay.
and started understanding how he and his brother and the Youngers, they all started out as Confederate guerrillas and they just basically never surrendered. They kept fighting by attacking banks and other people who had been connected to the Union in different ways. But one of my most interesting breakthroughs. The first 2 articles I wrote for Emerging Civil War were because I found family connections on both sides to the Centralia massacre and the Battle of Centralia. So I was looking for information about a different great-great-grandfather, and I found his name mentioned in this academic treatise that was online, and he was the postmaster for Centralia, and he got a postcard from a man named George Washington Bryson, saying, "Tell my sons that bullet from 40 years ago, I shattered my hip when I jumped on my horse and, I need help at the ranch." So he had moved to Texas. Well, Marnie Bryson was my great-great-grandma who'd married him. And so this was her brother. And it turned out that he got shot during the Civil War. He was helping out guerrillas, and he was recruiting among the Centralia area, and he got shot. And 40 years later, he jumped his horse and his hip shattered. And so his brother, James, also my great-great-grandmother's brother, when the Centralia massacre happened, Bloody Bill Anderson and various others set a train. They took 23 soldiers off of it, killed all of them, took one as a captive who was the one that was in charge. And he escaped later and was able to help tell some of the details of what happened. But they set the train on fire, set it down the trail, and it came to a stop by James Bryson's farm. So he also is mentioned in this academic record. And then it mentions that he was involved in the battle. And many, many years later, it also talks about Frank James coming back to be to a heroic kind of a welcome in Centralia, as everybody is anxious to hear about the stories he has to tell. And according to Jesse James, he is the one that shot the captain when they come after them after the massacre. They have the Battle of Centralia, where they end up battling 400 guerrillas, the largest group that had been assembled, and go in kind of fresh recruits. 2 weeks, and they'd just been in, for 2 weeks. They're on not very good horses. They don't have very good weapons, and they decide to dismount and go up against a bunch of mounted guerrillas, and they all get, just about all of them get killed in less than 3 minutes and butchered and scalped, and it's a gruesome, gruesome scene. And so I ended up writing those 2 articles for Emerging Civil War about discovering family connections. So there's this side, and then there's this letter from James where he writes, let me find this letter, that he almost was on that train. If he'd gotten
Wow.
the furlough that he was trying for, he would have been on that train. And so he didn't get his furlough, and where is it? I marked too many things, apparently.
See, just
Keep
proof that your
talking
book
for a
is
moment while I find this.
proof that your book is just chock full of cool stuff, though.
It
That's,
is. I was trying to mark some things to be able to share. Now I've got too many of them.
so, well, as you're looking, it was Stephen Douglas who won Missouri.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was thinking it was Douglas or Breckinridge. Thank you for looking it up for me, because both of them are mentioned in my book at different points.
Sure, 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 sure.
Well, anyway, in the same letter that he writes about, oh, here it is. Oh, but I made a lucky escape the other day by not starting home. The very train I would have been on was all massacred, stopped the cars. They was 24 soldiers on it. They shot them dead, robbed the train, set fire to it, and started it running down the track before it burnt up. About 3 o'clock, they come across some more soldiers and killed and scalped another lot. All amounted to 122. I am afraid to start home at this time. I would like to be at home, but I will hold on a few days longer. Write quick and let me know how you all are.
Wow.
So James just missed several things. He never actually saw battle, but
To his good fortune.
yes, to his good fortune. He got sick, as I said, at the end of June 1863, so he left Helena, and on July 3rd, they got attacked, and 49 men in his regiment were killed in Helena, Arkansas. Just as Vicksburg and Gettysburg are finishing, and there's Union victories, the Confederates decide to attack Helena. So that was another one he just missed. And when he first started out, he was marching around southern Missouri, watching for guerrillas, and they just missed the Battle of Hartville. So that was another one. And then another group that they passed on the road had just been attacked by guerrillas and had a bunch of their horses and things stolen. So he was fortunate, apparently, had more than one lucky day.
Wow. So now one thing that's sort of kind of coming to light for me, you talk about, how kind of what you learned in school about the Civil War, and it was sort of that neat and tidy Eastern centric view. You get this, what I would consider to be a life-changing box of stuff in the mail.
Mhm.
And suddenly your understanding of what the Civil War was all about is just turned upside down. And you come to the Civil War not necessarily as a Civil War scholar. Your background's in English, as I recall.
Right.
And so how does this box of letters transform your life and your understanding of
It
what the
really
Civil War
has.
is?
I mean, I've always loved writing, but mostly I've written poetry. And I did a lot of journalism. Originally, my career plan had been journalism, but I ended up becoming an English teacher. But all through college, I wrote for our college newspaper. I was editor of our high school paper and various editors in college. So what this really ended up being was a huge journalism project, is how I kind of saw it. It's not me creating a story. It wasn't me going out and writing a novel. It was taking a ton of sources, which was something I was actually pretty good at knowing how to do, and finding more information, more sources, and trying to organize it all in a way that made sense for not necessarily Civil War scholars and military scholars. I wanted it to be a book that I could share with my family also, because there's a lot of family members who are interested in this. And so I didn't bog down too much in trying to explain battles in terms of the strategies and the details, those kinds of things. It's more of an overview of those types of things. It gets a little bit more detailed about Centralia than it does some of the others. But I'm not as you said, I'm not a scholar of the Civil War. And so I've had a huge learning curve. Going to the symposium was helpful because it was talking about Vicksburg. And that had been a big part of my book, because James was in Helena, Arkansas from January through June, watching the build up to Vicksburg. And he talks about ships coming through and troops coming through, and his regiment was down at the Yazoo River and they were at the White River and they were looking for ways in, and their ways are failing, and so it's not happening yet. But so that I knew a little bit about Vicksburg, but I didn't know about the White River, Yazoo Pass. I mean, I didn't know all of that. So that was a lot of learning, and the symposium did help for that. I've also visited quite a few places now. I still have a lot more to go, but my introduction to Atlanta was Gone with the Wind.
Yeah, yeah.
I
As
in
it was
when
for
I
many people.
when I was in 8th grade and I got the chicken pox, I read Gone with the Wind in 2 days, and that was where I discovered a love for historical fiction. I was also studying American history that year in school, so I learned some about the Civil War, but to me it came so much more alive reading it in novel form. And so that was all I knew. This year we finally got to visit Atlanta. And so we went to Kennesaw Mountain and learned a lot more about the different battles there and saw the neighborhood. It's been built up again where most of the battles in Atlanta happened. But these letters also, since Benjamin marched with Sherman, I had to read a lot more about Sherman and marching through Atlanta. And Benjamin joins a little later, since he doesn't join until the Carolinas campaign. But it was interesting to read more details of the history of that, and also to see, and I think I mentioned this the last time when we talked, that Sherman and Johnson became such good friends later on, which I'd only ever heard terrible things about Sherman from the Southern perspective. And I'm sure there are still many that would share those same thoughts, but that he actually, once the fighting was done, he did a lot to help kind of start rebuilding things and getting together with Johnson and having that friendship. And so I liked reading that part too. That it showed how some people did overcome their differences to appreciate the good qualities in each other, I guess.
Yeah.
So
So I think about this life-changing box. My dog is barking in the background. I don't know if you can hear her. I apologize.
yeah.
You get this life-changing box, and I go back to your distant relative Jeremy, who decided to send this to
And
you.
he's not even a relative.
Oh no, he's not. Okay.
No, he had no connection. They just held on to this box for 30 years and
Oh wow.
rescued it.
Okay.
Yeah, his dad was a real estate agent who rescued the box.
Wow. 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 So
So
wow. Talk about serendipitous then.
I
Wow.
know.
So
And so we've stayed in touch. I've been sending him pictures. Look, here I am at James Hale's gravestone. Here I am at Benjamin Beach. Here I am in Atlanta. So I have, and I have a dream still. My actual original vision was to write a historical fiction novel. And what I would like to do is incorporate parts of the letters and also write the imagined story of what was going on for the family in Andrew County.
yeah.
And I don't have any letters from them, but I do see in his letters where he's responding to things going on there. So I could imagine, and that's where I could do research, and I'd have to obviously bring in fictional parts to it because I don't know what happened, but I think that would be a fun novel to write and hopefully for people to read.
That would be cool. So if people want to get your book, A State Divided, how do they get it?
They can go to Amazon.com and look up Tonya McQuade and A State Divided, and it will take them right there. It has a couple of reviews they can read, one from the genealogist at Andrew County, Kathy Ridge, and then another from Neil Chatelaine, who was another one of my early readers. And he actually helped me with some of the boat and ship allusions. And there was one where James, in one of his letters, he writes about somebody falling off the Imperial, and then he talks about how big this ship is, that it takes up the whole river, and the way he describes it was beautiful in a way. And I couldn't figure out what ship it was, and I asked Neil, and he sent me a link, and here it is, and and then I found pictures because the Harper's Weekly, it was one of the first ships to go down the river after it opened up. And so they had a big illustration of it, and talked about the ceremony of when it finally arrived down south, and people were there to cheer and all of these things. So that was another great addition to the book, to find out what this boat was.
Leave it to the Navy guy
I
to
know, the
unlock all
Navy
that
guy
stuff.
certainly helped.
Well, Tonya, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with me today.
Sure.
So I
Yeah,
wish you
I
the best
encourage
as you.
people to check out the book. I think the letters really are fun. They give a great perspective, and there is a lot of history thrown in there too.
Yeah, and of course, Missouri is one of those puzzles to the Civil War that a lot of people overlook. That I think really just bring to life how complicated the whole thing was.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Very
thank you
true.
so much. Good luck, and folks, check out A State Divided by
And
Tonya McQuade.
can I throw in one last
Please
thing?
do.
If
Please
they
do.
go to my website, which is TonyaGrahamMcQuade.com, I also have some pictures posted where it shows pictures from the box. And there are some in the book, but on the website, you can see in color and a little bit clearer vision of some of those things. And it has some more details about the book as well, and about how it all came about. So that's another resource for people. I just lost.
How do you spell Graham? Just for folks who
Oh,
have.
oh, so it's TonyAGraham McQuade.
All right, we'll be sure to put that link down in the description so if folks want to follow it that way. If you're following along on our YouTube page, but
Perfect. Thank
very
you.
good. Well, thanks so much, Tanya. I appreciate you spending some time with us today.
All right. Thanks for the time with you too.
Fantastic. I'm Chris Bukowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.